I want to begin by saying that this confession in its entirety is completely false. So why am I telling you this? I have no clue. Maybe you'll be able to pick out the pertinent details that will proclaim my innocence. All of that doesn't matter anymore, and the people concerned have all turned against me, even the closest ones that I have known for all my life. Funny how a convincing lie can ruin lies, isn't it? The one thing I will stress once again, before I begin, is any confession I give regarding this matter is completely false. I woke up a little later than usual with a headache. The first thing that I noticed was that the blinds were open, something that immediately sent me into an uneasy panic. I lived alone, with the exception of my cat, and so waking up with the blinds open was a shock, being that I always closed them before retiring for the night. I cautiously approached my bedroom door and slowly opened it, the sight before me giving immense relief. There was just an empty hallway, just the way I left it. It was dark in the hallway, as all the blinds in the rest of the house were closed, so I reached for the light switch and froze when I pulled my hand away, feeling a sticky substance coating my fingers. I stepped back into my bedroom and looked at my hand. My fingers were red now, and I was starting to feel nervous. Grabbing a flashlight from the nightstand drawer, I flicked it on and hesitantly moved back out to the hallway, the nervousness turning to confusion as I saw the source of the red. On the floor below the light switch, there was a small pot of red paint with a brush laid across the top, dribbles of paint leaking from the tip, indicating its freshness. I stepped past the paint and let the light play over the walls, and that's when I noticed that every socket and light switch had been covered with red paint. I opened the kitchen blinds, the light flowing in rendering my flashlight useless. I stopped for a moment at the sink, where I washed the paint off my hand, watching the crimson liquid mix with the water as the mixture gurgled down the drain. Leaving the water running, I picked up the coffee pot and filled it, then started the coffee maker. I turned around and leaned into the counter, feeling the earlier tension melt away with each breath. The coffee finished brewing and I poured a fresh cup, the steam slightly fogging my glasses as I leaned in to inhale the rich aroma of Nescafe. Sipping as I walked, I grabbed the mail from the mail slot and sat down on the living room couch, leafing through the mail. The last envelope in the pile was unmarked, no postmark, no return address, nothing. I opened it slowly, anticipating a death threat or something worse, maybe a letter bomb, but it was just a folded sheet of paper. I unfolded it, and in plain text, it was a simple invitation. You are cordially invited to a small function to be held at 12 noon in the next building. Dress casual and bring 2 pens. Why would I need to bring 2 pens? That seemed a bit too specific, and I wondered if I was the victim of a practical joke. I made a brief stop in the kitchen to top up my coffee, and then, armed with a rag, I made my way down the hall to my office to begin work for the day. Now with the blinds open, there was ample light revealing the painted mess in the hallway. I unlocked the office door and set my coffee down next to the keyboard and booted up the computer. I then walked back out to the hall, closing the door before I began to wipe the paint off the switches and sockets. I had to make several trips to the kitchen and back to rinse the cloth, now stained red. It took a bit longer than usual, but I felt like I had made a great accomplishment as I opened the office door and sat before the computer. The time seemed to go by quicker than usual, and before I knew it, it was 11:30 and I had to get my rear in gear. Pulling on a green turtleneck, I called an unanswered goodbye to my cat and went to the door, locking it behind me. After finally locating a spot in which to park, I checked my watch and hastened my pace. I had no idea whatsoever where this function was in the building, and I had only 2 minutes to spare before being late. After navigating the revolving doors, I sighed with relief as I saw a small sign indicating where the function was to be held. I kept my head low, and as a result, I ran into a man with a clipboard. Apparently this was an exclusive event, and when he asked for proof of my invitation, I inwardly slapped myself, realizing that I had left the invitation at home. As I attempted to stammer that I had forgotten my invitation, a woman came to the doors and said,
"Hi, Roberto. Glad you made it."
With a look at the man standing at the door, he stepped aside and I entered, following the woman. There were about 10 other people seated at various tables, and I found a vacant seat at an empty table and sat down. The woman stood in the center of the room at a podium and began to speak.
"Welcome, esteemed writers. I am very happy to have all of you here, and glad to see you made it without any problems."
She glanced in my direction and smiled as she said the last statement.
Anyways, let me introduce myself. I'm Julie Wickham. Now, I bet you're all wondering what all of the cloak and dagger regarding this meeting is. Well, I'll put some of your concerns to rest. You have all been selected to participate in a huge writing collaboration. Each of your writing styles fits the key points of the project, and now I am asking for your help.
The others in the room glanced at each other, some with expressions of continued unease on their face, and others with a glint of confidence and challenge in their eyes, clearly feeling slightly superior that they were chosen for such a prestigious honor. Julie Wickham was a well-known author, a recluse, which explained the need to introduce herself. Now, concerning the writing project, the only thing that was sparked within me was an unknown sense of dread, though the project seemed innocent enough. I decided to raise my hand and inquire, "So, what exactly is this project about?" My writing style was rather dark, and the few familiar faces in the crowd also had rather disturbing writing styles, which brought my unease to much higher levels.
I was just about to get to that. Thanks for the reminder, Roberto.
She looked at me and grinned with excitement.
How would all of you like to be part of a real-life experience based on what you have written?
She paused for a moment, allowing the room occupants to glance around at each other, then continued.
I do have to keep each of you in the dark for specifics at the moment, but when this meeting is finished, you will each receive a package outlining further details. The one thing I can tell you is, this is completely legal. Anything that happens as a result of what you do to accomplish this project will not have any consequences. I want each of you to assume the role of a character you have used previously and write about their day-to-day lives. But also, to go one step further, you will become that person and do as they do. The only stipulation that matters is that your lives must be based in reality.
Julie stepped away from the podium, and the people in the room began to converse, some seeming quite excited in their movements about the mention of no consequences, and others looking rather concerned. After cross-mingling between the groups, each group began to disperse, moving into collectives of those that shared in either their excitement or trepidation. I finally gave in and moved to speak with those that seemed uneasy regarding this project. I knew I needed to know more, so I asked, "How did all of you know about this meeting?" The general reply was that they had all received an unmarked envelope with a broad invitation inside. When the conversation died down, Julie and the man who stood outside the door split up, each handing a folder to every person in the room. The man who stood outside the door was the one who handed me this folder, and when he turned to walk away, I instantly recognized him. He had a vague look of guilt on his face, and why shouldn't he when the mention of no legal consequences was mentioned? The man who stood at the door was the chief of police himself. There were still muted conversations carrying on, but it was clear that the meeting had concluded. I quietly collected myself and slunk towards the door, and then someone stopped me.
You're leaving now? I wanted to speak with you more, to try and get to know the man behind the cover.
I froze up, any hope of replying lost with the statement. Only those very close to me knew that I had referred to myself as the man behind the cover. Literally, only 3 people knew of me in that way. My parents and my ex-girlfriend. Excuse me, I have to go, was the only reply I could muster as I pulled my arm free of her grasp and hurried towards the doors. I finally relaxed as I closed my front door behind me, letting out a sigh of relief as I did so. The entire way home was spent looking over my shoulder, noticing that it seemed everyone was keeping a close eye on me. I wondered for a moment if I was exhibiting some sort of force that drew everyone's eyes to me like a magnet to steel, but dismissed the thought, though it remained in my subconscious, stored for later. The doorbell startled me out of my concentration. I had been looking over the contents of the folder in my office, and what unfolded chilled me to the core. The most glaring piece of information was a form, signed by the Chief of Police and the DA, relinquishing any involvement if I were to commit any crime, big or small, as a result of writing this story. I had been gazing in disbelief as I read it over and over again when the doorbell startled me. I put down the form and grabbed my coffee cup, intent on refilling it after I answered the door. I looked through the peephole and nearly dropped my coffee cup when I saw 2 police officers standing on the stoop. I unlocked the door and opened it. "Hello, officers. Can I help you?" I asked in a politely guarded manner. The first officer spoke up. "Sir, we need to speak with you. May we come in?" I suppressed a shudder as I nodded and stepped aside, the officers entering without removing their shoes. I walked over to the kitchen, where I brewed a fresh pot of coffee as the officer sat in the living room. "May I ask what this is about?" I called as I gathered 2 more coffee cups in preparation to offer up. The coffee finished brewing and I filled all 3 cups and then entered the living room, handing the officer some coffee. The first officer nodded his thanks and the second officer spoke up. "Thank you. Now, we are aware of your involvement in this new writing project, and, well, we have some concerns regarding your immunity from the law. My colleague and I will step back and allow this to happen, but we will be keeping a very close eye on you, just to make sure you don't let this get out of hand." The officer finished with a sip of coffee, and the first officer continued on from that point. "This is really good coffee. Anyways, speaking for both of us, I would like to ask a favor of you, if you don't mind." "Thanks, it's just Nescafe. So, ask your question already." I still felt uneasy, and it was starting to show. The officers exchanged a glance, and then the first officer asked, "Would you sign a copy of your book, Tales from the Void, for us?" I heaved a sigh of relief and smiled, still rather uneasy and now a bit confused. Sure, let me just grab a pen." I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out a pen and proceeded to sign each officer's book. The officers shared a glance of repressed glee as I handed each book back to them. Without another word, they set their coffee cups on the table and stood to move back towards the door. The first officer was already out the door and the second officer turned back to me. "Thank you again. I think it may be in your best interest to let us get to know the man behind the cover. It may help you out in the long run." I felt the blood drain from my face as he said that phrase. How was everyone finding out this private detail? I muttered a vague agreement and farewell, and then closed the door behind me and leaned against it. This was becoming too much, and I feared something bad happening. I signed the form and set it down, turning my attention to the other documents in the folder I had received earlier. These pages just further outlined what Julie had mentioned earlier about assuming a character and living out their life. I felt quite uncomfortable about actually committing any of the atrocities that I had written about previously, and so I decided to break the rules a little, beginning to create a new character, one with mental abilities far beyond that of a normal person. They had the ability to influence other people's thoughts and subsequent actions, something I found to be a fair compromise. I would do my best to influence others to commit any misdeeds, and still keep my hands relatively clean concerning any wrongdoings. My stomach rumbled and I glanced at the clock, noting with some alarm that it was now 10 p.m. I hadn't even eaten all day. I guess it goes to show that what you have on your mind can take precedence over even basic instinctual needs. I saved what I had written so far about the new character and went to the kitchen, where I put some leftovers in the microwave and watched them rotate until they were deemed heated enough. I broke the stir just long enough to pour the remaining coffee into the sink, as it was now cold, and I didn't feel much like working anymore that night. I wolfed down the leftovers and put the plate in the sink next to the empty coffee cups, leaving them for tomorrow. Walking down the hall, I entered the office and shut the computer down. I locked the door again and walked towards my bedroom, where I turned off the hallway light and closed the blinds. Getting into bed, I thought back on the day I had just had, and as I drifted off to sleep, I thought I could vaguely hear the sound of my blinds opening. I awoke to the sun streaming in through my window, filling me with sleep-assisted confusion. When the grogginess cleared, I remembered closing the blinds the night previous, and once again have awoken to them being wide open. This time, I swung my legs out of bed and went right to the door, throwing it open heedless of anything. I poked my head out the door and slapped the hallway light switch. I found it on the fourth slap, being rewarded with a dim, red light casting an eerie glow throughout the hall. I stepped into the hall and looked up at the light, kicking an object as I stood below the light. I was distracted from the object I kicked by a drop of wetness on my face. I put my finger to the spot and pulled it away, noting the red paint now on my finger. Now very anxious, I scanned the floor for what I had kicked and saw an overturned paint pot leaking onto the carpet. Caution aside, I immediately rushed to right the paint pot, hoping that it wouldn't stain the carpet. I stepped over the paint stain as I jogged to the kitchen to retrieve a rag. I made short work of the light bulb and carpet, the paint coming off with surprising ease. Now that the bulb was clear, I could also make out red handprints that lined the walls, so I scrubbed at them, but no matter how much effort I expended, the handprints remained. Standing back to take a break, I could see that the handprints were slightly smaller. I held my hand up to one of them, and my hand completely covered it. As I made contact with the wall, the muscles in my hand and arms seized as if I had just touched a live wire. Backing away gingerly, my nerves broke as I saw a handprint materialize out of nowhere, and I ran for my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I woke on the floor of my room with a red-stained rag next to me. Snapping back to reality, I jumped up and opened the door to see nothing amiss. The light was on, yes, but there were no longer any handprints along the walls. I blinked and rubbed my eyes several times, and seeing that nothing was wrong, I decided to walk to the kitchen to start up a pot of coffee. I unlocked my office door and stepped inside. Starting my computer, I set the coffee cup down and sat in my chair. While I waited for the computer to do its thing, I glanced around the room, my eyes coming to rest on a picture that sat on my desk, a picture of my girlfriend and I on the camping trip where I had first proposed. A ping from my computer broke my sad, longing stare, and I turned to face the monitor. The work I saved last night was still there, and I realized with a bit of discomfort that this character description and such was nearly complete, meaning that I would have to begin my actual work. One of the things mentioned within the forum was that there was a 1-week deadline on the project, meaning that I had no choice to put it off. I had to go out and do my thing and write about it when I would return home each night. Sighing, I finished typing the document and saved it. Copying and pasting a more portable description to carry with me to guide me, I printed off a copy and stood. I put the computer in sleep mode and locked the office door behind me. My legs turned to jelly as I decided to go over the list and began to truly comprehend what I actually would have to do. Putting the list back in my pocket, I walked out the door and locked it behind me. I spotted an unmarked police car parked up the street and looked closer, seeing the officers from the day previous seated in the car. The officer in the passenger seat looked up from whatever he was doing and noticed me, giving a brief wave. I shakily raised my hand in return, then walked to my car, then drove off. I arrived in the shadier, more industrial part of downtown and immediately spotted a homeless fellow walking by. It was now or never. I stared intently at the homeless man, attempting to direct all of my mental strength towards him, silently willing this to work. A minute into the stare, the man lifted his head and straightened up, leaving the shopping cart he had been pushing and walked towards a convenience store. I could see a brief commotion through the window and tried to stave off the desperate need to flee, reminding myself that it was either commit the crime or watch it happen. The man came running out of the door with a plastic bag, his jacket and face covered with blood. I sat rooted to the spot, the desire to see what had happened now worming its way into my mind. It's like watching a plane crash. You want to look away, but you can't. I finally mustered the courage to leave the safety of my car and walk towards the convenience store. The homeless man was sitting next to his shopping cart, blood now nowhere in sight, clutching the bag as if it were a child. I grasped the handle of the door, minding the blood, and opened it. I nearly fainted when I saw the carnage behind the counter. The clerk's face was now fused with the screen of the cash register, and any blood that wasn't covering the walls and floor was dripping into the open, empty cash drawer. That wasn't what made me feel faint. The clerk's shirt had been ripped open and a gaping hole adorned his back, the edges of the wound ragged as though it were made by teeth. I made it back to my car and more or less fell into the seat, shivering. I pulled my legs inside and shut the door, pulling out my list as I did so. Regardless of what I had just witnessed, I did have a deadline, but I wanted to go slower this time, realizing the power concealed in my mind. I shakily drove off, nearly sideswiping a parked car as I did so. Driving along, I stopped at a bridge under repair. The flagger had the stop sign out, so I had no choice but to wait. A thought crossed my mind as I looked at the flagger, and I realized I couldn't stop it from happening. The stop sign fell to the ground as the flagger walked, in a trance, towards the open barrier of the edge and jumped. There was no reaction from any of the crew working on the bridge. Another person walked over to where the flagger had stood moments before, picked up the sign, and turned it to the slow side, giving a smile and waving me through. Moving forward slowly, the only thought in my mind was the urge to return home before I could do any further harm. As I parked, I noted that the unmarked car was no longer parked across the street. I unlocked my front door and nearly fell through, catching myself on the doorknob. As I closed the door behind me, I wanted nothing more than to crawl into bed and pull the covers over my head, wishing this was all just a dream. But my duty was to the project, so instead I entered the kitchen and started the coffee maker. It was going to be a long day ahead now, and I needed all the help I could get. The words flowed from my fingers onto the keyboard with surprising ease, and before I knew it, I had outlined every minute detail from what store the homeless man's shopping cart had been liberated from, to the colors of the soles of the flag's shoes as they did their swan dive into the river below. I scarcely could recall the time spent actually dictating these details to my computer, and when I went to take a sip of coffee, I found the cup empty, so I went to refill it, but found the coffee pot also empty. I saved my work and shut the computer down, then locked the office door behind me. Sitting on the living room couch, I reached into the end table and pulled out a small ashtray and bottle of bourbon. Those were reserved for when things would get particularly stressful when it came to my writing. Setting my empty coffee cup down and filling it with Jim Beam, I looked out the front window and could make out the silhouette of an unmarked car parked across the street once again. Lighting a cigarette, I went to close the blinds, not wanting to be reminded of anything that happened during the day. Maybe the third glass of bourbon in, I was able to rationalize that this was just another job and nothing more. The fifth glass, I began to discount the truth that I had caused those two acts to occur, brushing it off as just another mentally ill homeless guy and a suicidal flagger. My stomach heaved as I recalled the scene at the convenience store, so I opted to put the bourbon away and stub out the cigarette. I weaved and stumbled my way down the hallway to my bedroom, where I collapsed into bed, neglecting to close the door and the blinds. I awoke to a dark room, and was momentarily relieved as I saw my blinds were closed. I sat up and rubbed my eyes, but halted as I saw the door to my room sitting ajar. I could recall leaving the door and the blinds open, but now the blinds were closed. I trudged over to the window and opened the blinds, where I was met with a concerning sight. The wall next to the window was covered in handprints, and a message was scrawled below. "The blood is on your hands." I looked down at my hands and saw a deep gash in the center of each of my palms. I screamed, falling to the floor and backing away as if to distance myself from all the blood. My right hand brushed something and I flinched, looking down. There was a pot of red paint to my right, just sitting there. Examining my hands closer in the light, I saw that the previous gashes were nowhere in sight, and instead, my hands had a thin film of paint covering them. Walking blindly down the hallway towards the kitchen, I decided to leave the lights out, not wanting to find any more unwelcome surprises. After cleaning my hands, I took a breath and went about the house, opening all the blinds. Moving back towards the bedroom to prepare for the day, I was relieved that nothing was wrong with the hallway, and I felt a sense of confused calm take hold as I saw my room. No handprints, writing, or paint pots in sight. Pulling a clean shirt and pants on, I collected my wallet and keys. Locking the front door, I looked around for the police car, and it was nowhere in sight. The feeling of being watched was still there, and I hesitantly approached my car to leave. Driving away, I thought I could see a pair of headlights following me as I looked in the rearview mirror, but when I looked the second time, they looked more like eyes. I parked near a busy gas station and turned off the engine. Each pump had a car parked in front of it, and I focused on the gas station itself, imagining a fireball rising into the sky. As the image materialized in my mind, all of the people at the pumps pulled the gas nozzle from their car and dropped it to the ground. They just stood there, as if awaiting further instruction. The attendant came running out of the store, flipping out, and then stopped. He relaxed, and then pulled a lighter from his shirt pocket, lit it, and dropped it to the ground. The gasoline ignited instantaneously. Through the haze of the intense inferno, I had time to see the forms of people burning before each pump exploded, sending a large, bright fireball into the sky. A second later, my car rocked from the concussion wave of the explosion. I didn't hesitate to key the car and get out of there as fast as I could, nearly hitting a passerby as I fled. I looked back for a moment and saw the passerby stop, turn, and then jump in front of a fire truck responding to the explosion. I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled over and wept, pounding the steering wheel in frustration. When I had calmed down a bit, I saw a little girl standing at my window with a stuffed rabbit in her hand. I wiped away the last of the tears and rolled down the window, keeping my eyes closed.
Are you okay, mister? Look at Runs. Maybe you won't be sad anymore.
I opened my eyes, a single tear falling as I looked at Runs. The little girl opened her mouth to say something, but then all the life left her eyes and she shoved the small stuffed rabbit in her mouth, shoving it deeper and deeper down her throat until I could see her neck bulge. Her skin took on a sickly gray color and she collapsed, beginning to seize, all the while still attempting to force the rabbit down her throat. I floored it, feeling a bump under my car as I ran over a woman, possibly the little girl's mother, who had jumped in front of my car. I had no way of avoiding the accident. Despite the urge not to, I looked back and saw every person in the vicinity of the area turn their attention to me and begin to walk towards my car, falling behind as I accelerated faster and faster away. I jumped the curb in front of my house and the engine stalled. I yanked the keys from the ignition, the tunnel vision only allowing my front door to be visible. I ran, uninhibited, towards the door and was met with an unseen object. I felt hands under my armpits catch me before I hit the ground, and I looked up to be greeted with the concerned eyes of the second officer from the other day. The first officer was nowhere in sight. The officer helped me to my feet and then gently pulled my keys from my grasp and unlocked the front door. Helping me inside, the officer led me to the couch and then walked into the kitchen, where he started the coffee maker, this time only using water. When the pot was full, he rooted through the cupboards and located 2 cups in my tea stash. Dropping 2 tea bags into the pot of steaming water, he made his way back to the living room and sat down opposite me. I calmed down as I gradually sipped my tea, and when I could string a sentence together, I asked, "What are you doing here?" The officer gave me a small smile and then replied, "I've seen this happen before. This watch was my idea, as many years on the job have taught me that repeating the past leads to a lot of trouble. Trust me, what you've done is nowhere near how serious it was last time." I looked bewildered up at the officer, as if he had just sprouted wings. "Don't worry, I'm not here to arrest you, I'm only here to help." "How did you know what was going to happen?" I asked, a quiver in my voice. "My partner ripped his eyes out yesterday. I was the one responsible. Trust me, you aren't the only one with this gift." I narrowed my eyes, filled with disbelief. "Or curse, whichever way you want to put it. I know all about your contract, and what you don't know is, when the project is complete, all the legal responsibility falls on your shoulders. I have a way that I can help you suppress this talent, but I need your full and complete trust in order for it to work." I gave the only response that I could. "Tell me what to do." The officer pulled a booklet of papers from his jacket pocket, and over the next hour, he outlined all that needed to be done in order for this to work. I went through the whole gamut of emotions during this time, and eventually settled on determination. "Can I look this over and give you my decision in the morning?" Concern briefly traced the officer's face, but still he nodded and rose, ready to leave. "I'll be right out front whenever you're ready," said the officer. Then he turned and walked out the door. Rinsing out the coffee pot and filling it, then starting the coffee maker, I mulled over my options. If I went ahead with this solution, I would likely be institutionalized and studied meticulously like an ant under a microscope, and I may not even see the true light of day ever again. But if I didn't do anything, who knows what can happen? With my coffee in hand, I retreated to the office and sat down, ready to continue on with the project. When I went to refill my coffee, I spotted the officer parked behind my car, reading a book. I opened the front door and called out to him, and he looked up, concern in his eyes. The look of concern turned to an expression of pure terror just before he pulled out his gun and put it to his temple, firing. My hair hung in my eyes as I turned, dazed, and shut the front door. I filled my cup with the remaining coffee and went to finish that day's work. After saving everything, I turned out the lights and locked the door, walking down the hall to my bedroom, where I closed the door and blinds, stripped, and fell onto the bed, exhausted. I woke to an unmistakable noise, the noise of my blinds being opened. I shot up, the weak light filtering in, giving me a glimpse of who was responsible for the paint and the other stuff. The figure looked a bit... No, it was me. I stared at myself, trying to make sense of all of it, and that was when I turned around and stared directly at myself. This doppelganger seemed to be quite off. Their eyes were dark, nearly black, and their face seemed to swim and change, making it impossible to confirm whether or not it was me. In the second that we made eye contact, my eyes began to burn, and when I finally blinked, the blinds were wide open and the figure had vanished. I went straight into my office, looking for the file that I had received on Wednesday, intent on finding a phone number. After a few rings, Julie Wickham herself answered, sounding groggy.
Yes?
"I need to speak with you immediately about this project."
Who is this?
"It's Roberto. Please, this is very important."
Oh, the man behind the cover. Why don't we meet later? I'll come by your house for coffee and we can get this all resolved.
"Fine," I said, and then hung up. there was a knock at my door right after, and I shivered. I didn't answer the door immediately, instead going to the kitchen to start the coffee. Another knock came, and I finally answered the door to see Julie Wickham standing there. Upon opening the door, she walked past me without even being invited in. She sat down, and I saw no other choice but to offer her a cup of coffee, to which she graciously accepted. I want out of this. Julie smiled and took a gulp of coffee, and then said,
You got yourself in, you get yourself out. This is why we encourage people to adhere to the guidelines of actually doing things rather than willing others to.
I stared wide-eyed. Julie smiled wider and leaned back in her chair.
I'll leave you with this, Roberto. Whatever you decide to do, you are doomed. Now, you can choose to live out your last few days of freedom, doing what you love and having the same afterwards, or you can do what I already know you will, sealing your fate completely.
The smile on her face evaporated into a blank look as she smashed the coffee cup on the table and drove a shard into her throat. I felt numb, knowing what she meant by sealing my fate. Which leads me back to the beginning, to my false confession. All that transpired did happen, and I did write it, but when I confess my guilt to these crimes, I'm lying. I feel no remorse for my actions, for all I did was think about things. The people that actually committed the deeds did so on their own accord. It's amazing what the power of an idea holds. It has brought civilizations to their knees, paved the way for homicide, genocide, slavery, and stuff that's much more severe than those three. Innocent people die every day, just because of an idea. It could be a husband that gets the false idea that his wife is cheating and bludgeons her to death with a hammer. It could be a person saying something controversial and their peers deeming them insane. Or it could be an idea for a story, something that starts as a small seed in the mind that grows much too big for anything to support it.